Order. The House and Committee is resumed. The House is considering the Telecommunications, Interception, Capability and Security Bill, and we begin at Part 2. So the question is that Part 2 stand part. Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, this is Part 2 of the Telecommunications, Interception, Capability and Security Bill, which we are in the committee stage of, and we're now talking about Part 2. This is the provision, this is the part of the bill which I would describe as being the tying itself up in knots part of the bill, because this is the part of the bill which essentially the discussion that was happening in Part 1 takes effect around how those definitions play out, particularly with regards to the service providers. And the service providers, for the sake of anybody listening in, are the organisations, the companies that are becoming more and more prevalent in our lives, and we're otherwise known as the over-the-top providers, such as the Facebooks, the Googles, the Microsofts, and other such entities. Mainly they are entities that have a base in another country rather than in our own country, and these are becoming the big organisations that are enabling us to communicate in all kinds of different ways. How the provisions of this Act relate to those service providers is very important, because, as we discussed in the last part of this Act, the definition of service providers is so broad and so encompassing that it does provide a conflict, potential conflicts with international law, and also how this generally plays out in the ability for them to provide what's called that duty to assist our surveillance agencies. I just want to put on the record that while Labor is opposed to this bill in its entirety, we are not at all opposed to the modernisation of the law, and we're not opposed to the provisions that existed in the previous legislation, which put a duty to assist on organisations, to duty to assist the surveillance authorities when there was cause to do so. The problem that we have in this part of the bill, Mr. Chair, is that there's several problems, but I think it's at clause 35 is probably the most significant part of this part of the bill, where it gives a deem-in provision to the Minister, and the Minister who's actually sitting in the chair at the moment, extraordinary powers, extraordinary unheard of powers that we haven't seen in this country before, where a Minister gets, for whatever reason, gets to have the power to decide whether a service provider can be deemed in to become a network operator. Now, a service provider, just so that everybody knows, has to have a duty to assist, and that's fair enough. There's no issue with that. But the ability to deem in that service provider, such as Google, such as Microsoft, such as Facebook, into becoming a network operator, which would then come under the provisions in Part 3, which are much, much stronger, then means that they become essentially an organisation which our surveillance agencies can have an enormous amount of power over. Now, the conflict in law is actually really important. And just so that, again, so that everybody knows, in her last-minute SOP that was brought before the House, the Minister deleted clause 39, which is in this part, which is the reseller clause, which will have some beneficial effect, I suppose, for some of our internal telco organisations, so that there's a bit more of a fairer playing field for them when it comes to making available to the New Zealand public their products and the onerous conditions that could have been put on them through this bill. But we are very Mr. Chair.
Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We are very dubious about the assurances which have been given by officials during the passage of this bill through the Select Committee that this TICS bill could require non-New Zealand service providers to provide access to customer data to the New Zealand government, which is at odds with their own domestic legal obligations. Now, the point that is being made here, and it has certainly been made very publicly in the last week by these organisations, and this isn't about, getting in behind them and thinking that they're wonderful, but why is it that there should be a piece of legislation going through this House where there's a question mark over whether it's in direct conflict with international law? It's just simply not good enough, because the warnings were given, the submissions were made, they were made very powerfully, but for some reason they've been ignored. Secondly, in this part of the bill, and I know there will be more discussion by my colleagues around this, and this goes directly to the amendment in Labour's SOP, that after clause 35, which is for everyone who cares to pick up the bill and have a look, it's on page 38 after line 5. Labour intends to put forward, or has put forward, an amendment that creates a technical advisory board, which is a check and balance. Now, this is the other major issue with this bill, again, which there are many, is that there are no checks and balances. And when we're talking about privacy, when we're talking about the rights of citizens, and not just citizens but companies, and their ability to innovate, their ability to control their own destinies, and their ability to go about their business in a context where security for the country, for the bigger picture interest, is brought into balance, unfortunately that balance has been tipped. One of the problems is that we do not have enough checks and balances in this law. We contend that there should be a technical advisory board established, as was recommended by many of the submitters. The submitters, which included the Telecommunications Carrier Forum, which is the peak body group for all of the major telcos in New Zealand, that they said that there needed to be, such as there is in the UK, under legislation in the UK, a technical advisory board, which is essentially a panel which is set up to provide advice, and to provide advice before the decisions are made by the Minister on whether or not there should be interception undertaken, and it should have an independent chair. Now, Mr. Chair, this is, as I've said in the second reading of this bill, New Zealand is a small, stable, peaceful democracy. We take those principles really seriously in this country as to what they actually mean and how they're reflected in law and in regulation. This law, this piece of legislation before us today, tips that balance, and it tips the balance in favour of state surveillance in secrecy, without checks and balances. And I'd like to hear directly from the Minister, who still hasn't got to her feet yet in this debate, still hasn't got to her feet, has, and after 2 hours pretty much that we've been here, still hasn't got to her feet, because, and one of the reasons why is that I'm starting to ask myself whether she just doesn't understand the legislation that's before her, doesn't understand the impacts of it, hasn't listened to the community, hasn't listened to the industry, and certainly isn't taking any heed of what the implications are of her draconian piece of law which is before us today. She shakes her head. Unfortunately, I have come to the conclusion that she actually doesn't understand it, because otherwise we would actually be hearing from her as to what are the implications. Why is it that a technical advisory board could not be put in as a check and balance to provide the public with an assurance?
Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm